expressed gratitude in the South African government's efforts in dealing with recent spate of xenophobic attacks that hit the country recently. Now, the PAP says such attacks may constitute a major setback in achieving unity in the African continent. But to help prevent similar incidents, the Pan-African Parliament has suggested a couple of possible solutions. But now for more on those solutions, we're now joined by the PAP Secretary General, Zwelakhe Madasa. Good morning to you, sir.
Morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. Let's start off with how the PAP has observed these xenophobic attacks and how you feel they've affected relations, between South Africa and other African countries.
Yes, we have observed the attacks by some local South Africans on Africans coming from other member states of the African Union. I prefer to characterize it like that. I don't like to get to this coinage of xenophobic because I'm not sure what it means. We've observed these violent attacks and we are very concerned about them. As we have said in our statement, because from our perspective of building African unity and an integrated continent that is strong politically, this is a setback because then it sets back all the programs that have been put together to build our continent. But not only that, of course, mainly we're concerned about loss of life. And of course, secondarily, this issue will be a setback to development because it affects investment and intra-trade in Africa.
And Mr. Madasa, do you feel that, the South African government in general has done enough to ensure that they address these attacks in South Africa?
Well, as we said in our statement, we are pleased that the government is taking the steps that it is taking. Even when I entered here, I saw in the news that the president is addressing leaders of communities that are in South Africa from outside, and various ministries have gone out of their way to address the issues. However, we believe that essentially this is a political problem. What the government is doing is correct for now, as far as addressing the security issue. But we need to go further than that and address the root causes, which is the political problem. What I mean by that is that we have a continent that is fragmented by the history of colonialism, imperialism, and apartheid. Now the strategy of the continent is to unite and become integrated in one continent. Now what we believe has not been done by both the African Union and by different member states, including South Africa, is to then come up with a strategy which is based on a situational analysis that this project of uniting the continent, what are the risks to it and how to mitigate those risks. Firstly. Secondly, to have a comprehensive communication strategy so that you close this gap between the leadership and the people, because there's a huge gap that these decisions are being made at top level. But the people are not aware of what this United Africa means and what in reality are they people expected to do. So the gap is big there. So I think what the government is doing is correct, but rather than preventing the so-called xenophobic attacks, that program should be continuous to unite Africans. Yeah. So those forums of various civil society organizations should be the forums of discussing the unity of Africans, just like we did in the 80s, because that approach you see there on television and by the government is what was done in the 80s to unite South Africa towards a new future. So now we need to embark on a similar campaign, but to unite Africans to a new future.
As the PAP,
I think that's the approach.
But as the PAP, do you observe these attacks as xenophobic or more Afrophobic? Because there's been an ongoing debate about, where these attacks come from and where exactly they're directed to and who they're directed to. So as the PAP, in your opinion, do you observe them as more xenophobic or Afrophobic?
I'm avoiding this terminology really. I think this is a complex issue. I think there's an element of criminal opportunism by locals purely to want to commit crime for whatever reason. I think there's an element perhaps of resentment by some isolated people within South Africa when they see other people succeed. And then instead of dealing with that, they resort to mobilizing against those people because they are not local. I think there's an element which I tried to address earlier on of what are the challenges to African unity. Remember, they are beneficiaries to a continued fragmented continent because the people who used to colonize us, when we remain fragmented, it justifies their continued stealing of resources on the continent. It gives them moral high ground to continue to babysit the African continent, to give it aid, to assist us as people who cannot govern ourselves, and so on and so on. I think that element is very important to analyze as to whether are they not contributing in some covert ways to continue to fragment us. I believe that it's not a coincidence that all now major African economies are experiencing violence. What I mean by that, we have Egypt. We have Libya destroyed by the Europeans. We have Algeria threatened by terrorism. We have Nigeria. We have Kenya. Now we have South Africa. I don't think politically we can just think that it's a coincidence.
But Mr. Madasa, some of the people that have, of course, been participating in these attacks claim that the reason why they are attacking foreign nationals is because of the popular statement they make that they're taking their jobs and that they are responsible for a majority of the criminal activities that we see in the country. So clearly you don't see any merit in those claims.
Yeah, no, I don't see any merit on those claims. I was once a member of parliament, and I won't mention the ambassador, which country he came from, but it was an ambassador of a European country. When South Africa was working on unifying the Ivorians in order to ensure that there are elections in Cote d'Ivoire, this particular ambassador came to our committee in parliament. And you know what he said to us? He asked us as to why do we allow our government to be involved in West Africa, which is French-speaking. He said, our information is that in South Africa there's a lot of poverty, and you should be putting money on poverty in South Africa instead of wasting your time on the continent. So there's this narrative that Africans cannot work together, and there are jealousies and so on, and therefore there's a discouragement towards the free movement of people and integration. So I think, as I'm trying to say, there are politics at play here, but nonetheless, we cannot politicize everything. There might be elements that needs to be dealt with, and I think the government is doing well on that score.
And moving forward, then, Mr. Madasa, what are some of the solutions that the PAP is suggesting in moving forward and ensuring that these attacks do not happen again?
You see, the continent has a policy of free movement of people, goods, services, and intra-trade. I think there needs to be a comprehensive strategy to standardize the registration of people in Africa. Part of the problem, we have a free movement of people who are not registered. You don't know who they are, and the incentive to commit crime by those elements is very easy because you know that you cannot be caught. If you are caught, nobody knows who you are. So we need, South Africa in particular must play a leading role here to capacitate neighboring states and and other continental states to make sure that we have a standardized system of registration of people so that we can have confidence on the systems and procedures of each other. So I think that there's that issue, that everybody must be registered and according to a system that we all accept. Secondly, I think there must be a comprehensive communication strategy by each country and by the continent at central level, whereby we close this gap between the people and these programs of the Union. Thirdly, I think in addition to SABC, we need to have our own media that communicates what Africa is doing, what Africa wants, so that these Western media houses will discourage them from communicating messages that are negative towards the African unity. Fourthly, I think that the African Union should mobilize civil society, as we see South Africa is doing now, across the continent, religious communities, women and youth organizations, traditional leaders, I want to emphasize that, so that everybody is involved and understand what this African unity is about, so that the people themselves can drive the unity of the continent. I think in that way you will prevent future attacks.
Well, Secretary General of the Pan-African Parliament, Mr. Zwelakhe Madasa, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.